there is a largely overlooked Italian genre of movies that I'm going to introduce you to, those who don't already know about it, and put its surprisingly crucial role in film history into context. Now, I know that there's some people who know all about it, but many, if not most, don't. The average American horror movie fan has never heard of these. They really are under the radar still. Despite what's mentioned in my video title, these are the movies, this is the genre that took us from Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho to Halloween, but not just that, the entire 80s American slasher genre, which is still going strong. I'm making this video in 2022 during the Halloween season, and here is the, they say, final installment of the Halloween franchise. In theaters now, 44 years after the original. And then just think about all the movies and subgenres that came out of, or, in response to the 80s slasher flicks. But these movies are much more than just proto-slashers. They are their own thing. Stylistically, tonally, narratively. So let's start with how to identify one of them. Genre rules are always interesting, right? They're fungible. But Giallo is Italian for yellow, and the movie's got that moniker because pulp crime novels like these in Italy, translations of English and American works, had, as you can see, yellow covers. This was what was sourced to make a lot of the Giallo movies. However, they definitely became their own thing in cinema. And what was that thing? It's been described as a mashup of noir and horror. Others call it a combination of horror, suspense, and sexploitation. An article title on IMDb distills it all down to murder, razors, and leather gloves. It sounds pretty weird, doesn't it? But trust me, it gets weirder than that. The typical Giallo movie is a murder mystery. There's always a mystery killer, or sometimes killers, and the central plotline involves trying to identify who that is. The typical Giallo murderer is leather-clad from kind of toes to fingers, you might say. Their face is obscured by a fedora and dark shadows, sometimes even a mask. Favorite weapons are a cutthroat razor, as seen here, or a knife. Favorite victims are women, especially attractive women. The killings are bloody, excessively bloody. That's part of the horror aspect, especially the slasher part, but as far as kind of horror overall, there's the fright factor and dark, scary environment, the woman realizing someone's after her, trying to get away, that kind of a thing. And check out this amazing visual, the killer from Blood and Black Lace, 1964, directed by Mario Bava, who invented the genre in 1963. But we'll get back to that. The killings can have a psychosexual overtone, and I think that's part of the Psycho inspiration. And as in Psycho, the killer is usually acting out from some source of psychological trauma. But it's also not just a case of this one aberration, this one, psychologically damaged person that's killing others. You can't trust a lot of people in one of these flicks, and that's where I think these are definitely part noir. All noir might have crime fiction, but not all crime fiction is noir. So it's not just a murder mystery, but usually there's all kinds of unsavory characters, a lot of backstabbing, multiple parties with dirty secrets they want kept. Like here in Bava's 5 Dolls for an August Moon. Or here, 1972 CD, Your Vice is a Locked Room and Only I Have the Key. With those last two references, that makes a good opportunity to note that one of the traditions within these films is that they have long and Byzantine titles. Another ingredient to mention, and one that differs from Psycho, the original inspiration, and Friday the 13th, etc., the later descendants, is what we might call the in vogue component. The people are beautiful, but they're also beautifully dressed and hanging out in fashionable places. The previously mentioned Blood and Black Lace takes place almost entirely in a fashion house. You're looking at a still from the brilliant opening sequence of 1970's The Bird with the Crystal Plumage, directed by one of the giants of the genre, often called the Italian Alfred Hitchcock, Dario Argento. And you can see that the mystery begins in an art gallery. And so you get swanky Italian settings, and that's real different from, again, think about Psycho, it's set in rural America, and the slasher movies are usually out in the country or in just a regular neighborhood, right? I mean, they're not normally set in Manhattan penthouses. Getting back to the pure pulp aspect, something that is not always present, but, just like in the old cheesy pulp covers, I mean, really old school, early 20th century crime fiction comics and dime store novels, you will get the beautiful woman falling down just so that it happens to line up her cleavage with the camera. That's not what I'm showing you here. I'm trying to find something a little bit more respectful for the YouTube video so I don't get in trouble. But there is that cheap enticement as well. Sometimes it, or a scene of characters sleeping together, serves the story. Other times it's flatly gratuitous. This was not high art. But it is artful. And that's a dichotomy that makes the movies interesting. You can have the clickbait, if you will, but then you can also have, gorgeous sets, camera work, lighting, a legitimately creepy atmosphere, a good mystery, and just a fun watching experience. So as you can tell, these movies are a kind of genre mixed bag, and they do not fit into any one pat definition or category. But that's the genre. It's these Italian movies from the 60s and 70s. Heyday was definitely more in the 70s. 60s, it was kind of ramping up, this style. But it's this wonderful, improbable mix. It's, these fashionable settings with beautiful people that feature a murder mystery, always a twist at the end, revealing who the killer was, but then also explaining the psychosis that's driving them. So it's that, with the dual cheap thrills of sex and violence, very much in the pulp vein. And it's all in a stylish package, not just meaning the locations and the people and the clothes, but just it's highly stylized. The music might be very present, very in your face and noticeable. And these are sometimes called spaghetti slashers, right? A riff on spaghetti westerns. And think of like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, how highly stylized that movie is, or that whole genre is. The camera work and the music. You might notice Carl Malden in this screenshot. This was a funny thing. Once these movies started making some money, they would hire American and British actors sometimes. Actually, both of the leading men pictured here are American. But then these big names would just have their voices dubbed over in Italian. Meanwhile, the Italians they were acting with would of course have their voices dubbed over in English. For the export version of the movie, that would go back to, say, Carl Malden's country. This movie, by the way, is Argento's 1971 Cat of Nine Tails. So now let's get to the story of how these movies created that bridge that gapped Psycho to the 80s slashers. It started in 1963, and in black and white, as you can see here, when Bava, by universal agreement, invented the genre. This is The Girl Who Knew Too Much. Setting a template that would be copied many, many times, our protagonist is not a professional investigator, anything like that at all, just a civilian, one who finds themselves trying to figure out who a mysterious killer is, partly because the police can't or won't do it, but more importantly because they have now gotten wrapped up in the case themselves and are in danger. This is a very Hitchcockian film. It is mostly a suspense film. It only has a couple of touches of the dual cheap thrills that we talked about before. I mean, you get scenes like this, not that big of a deal. Later on, this is our protagonist and she's in a bathing suit and the camera lingers on her. Meanwhile, on the gore front, you have two people killed with knives, basically a knife sticking out of their back, and a guy who I think was shot, and you can just see the bullet hole in his head, but it's very discreet. All of this is incredibly tame compared to later flicks. And the movie, just like Psycho, feels more like a product of the 1950s than the 1960s, but it goes further than a typical crime film from that earlier decade would. But the pieces were all in place, and just 1 year later, 1964, Bava, almost as a reflection of the changing times, reuses the template but goes full bore and, in my mind, truly invents the genre. As you'll see here and in the following images, it just looks much more swingin' 60s-ish. Looks 10 or even 20 years later, not 1 year later. And the training wheels are off, the killings are scarier, grislier, just in every way possible. It has no vestige of like the button-down, black and white 1950s. And the formula is really set at this point, including the leather-clad killer and everything we talked about before. You're looking at Robert Bloch, the author who wrote the novel Psycho, published in 1959. Just 1 year later, 1960, Alfred Hitchcock puts out his masterpiece based on this work. And just a few years later, all the way in Italy, a genre is born that would have later ripples throughout cinema and obviously the horror genre in particular. Movies that took this template and used it, but also altered it. Granted, there is some obviously downplayed but still present sexual subtext in this movie here. But years later, with looser standards, and it being Europe no less, the voyeurism, the amount of skin being shown, the amount of blood being spilled, all of that could be upped. And they were in a cavalcade of movies because this was a somewhat shameless attempt to crank out films that fit the formula and made money. Here's a still from 1972's The Case of the Bloody Iris. Actually, I'll do 2 more shots from the same movie, but we're basically now in the Giallo explosion, so there's all kinds of other people getting in on the act, like here. This movie was directed by Giuliano Carnimeo. Director Lucio Fulci got in on the action with several flicks, including 2 that you hear mentioned a lot when it comes to this genre. A Lizard in a Woman's Skin, 1971, and Don't Torture a Duckling, 1972. So he obviously honored the strange title convention, and that includes this movie here from 1977, Murder to the Tune of the 7 Black Notes. When it was translated and brought over, it was just called The Psychic. This Gialli, that's singular for Giallo, breaks kind of an unspoken rule within the genre because it has a supernatural component. Normally, these are not supernatural thrillers. And that's something that the later American movies seem to really lean into, right? Even like Michael Myers and Jason. You wouldn't couch those as supernatural movies, but it seems like they can't die. And then Freddy Krueger, the other member of that triumvirate, well, he's flat out supernatural, can kill you in your dreams. But speaking of those guys, and to finish this whole thing off, we have to jump back to 1971 to a movie by, once again, Mario Bava, the most important director in the history of these movies, even if he wasn't the best. Because not only did he invent the whole genre, but he made this movie, Bay of Blood. And this is, at least in my opinion, not a very good movie, but it was extremely influential and ahead of its time. This is Friday the 13th, a decade before Friday the 13th. It's teens at a lake, partying, got their hanky-panky, skinny dipping, all that, getting killed by a psychotic murderer in extremely bloody detail, that kind of phantasmagoria moment or moments, when you see the obviously fake head, but still disgusting fake head with the bladed instrument buried into it. And so its influence cannot be overstated when it comes to the types of films from the 1980s we've been discussing so much. And yes, side note, the original Halloween came out in 1978. I know, we're speaking broadly here. Anyway, one of the murder scenes from a Friday the 13th movie, the second, lifts a murder scene straight out of Bay of Blood. But that's not all there is to Bay of Blood. It is more complex than the early Jason, Michael Myers movies. The partying teens are just there to get killed, but meanwhile, there's a whole plot, really kind of the main plot, which has adults who are backstabbing each other and contriving to win land rights at the lake, double crossings and hidden motives, eccentric side characters like this woman here who reads tarot, and her husband, an amateur scientist, if I recall. That's kind of a Giallo mini tradition too, are the eccentric side characters. But anyway, I think you can see how we got from our starting point to our end point. The ingredients in the cocktail don't ever really change, but sometimes one flavor or ingredient is stressed far more than others. And the experimentation that the genre was about and that it created ended up creating this movie here, ironically perhaps by the whole genre's creator. And it and movies like it then gave birth to these blockbuster franchises, and just countless movies, not just within those franchises either, of course. And a love affair was born. How great is this picture, even though it's not very clear? Jamie Lee Curtis and, I guess you'd say Michael Myers. Campy slasher flicks that really focused on what were just garnishes, just kind of flourishes in the original mixture. Now, what I would call the classic Giallo recipe, it did survive, but its impact is not very wide. You'll still see it crop up once in a while. Pretty much if you ever see a visual like this in a modern movie, you're seeing a nod to these films. Here's a scene from a movie that is no longer modern, but legendary director Brian De Palma took obvious inspiration from the movies we're talking about with 1980's Dressed to Kill. The murder scene here clearly does that, but the movie does in other ways as well. Nicholas Winding Refn's 2011 masterpiece Drive borrows the familiar straight razor, see it there, wielded by Albert Brooks of all people. Actually, here it is again. Oh, what a great prop to have. But anyway, it's not just a matter of movies borrowing the signature weapon or look in one scene or sequence. No, there are actual, I guess what you'd call, neo-Giallo movies, which is great, but they are a tiny little outlier of a subgenre. I guess the other thing you could say is any kind of like suspenseful, sexy murder movie, like Basic Instinct, is, to my mind, kind of a Giallo offshoot. But there's no doubt that the monster that these movies created are the Bay of Blood-esque campy slashers. And if you didn't know, now you do. One, about these movies, because like I said, most people, at least generally speaking, don't know of them, and two, the surprising role that they played in film history. Thanks for watching. Hope you found that interesting.